Hello, welcome back to Math Time with Professor Prime, and I'm your host as always, Professor Prime. Let's talk about math and Dragon Ball GT. So, Dragon Ball GT is an interesting beast, and before we break down how this video is going to go, I wanted to point out it's kind of crazy to me on my end that I'm now covering Dragon Ball GT, and I mention that, and it also kind of makes sense at the same time, but we'll get to that. And I mention it because, right, like I have made like 200 videos about Math and Dragon Ball, right? Like I wrote a book on Math and Dragon Ball, and though I've mentioned Dragon Ball GT, I have not had an actual video dedicated to Dragon Ball GT. And if I'm being blunt, part of that is like I don't like it. Like I don't hate it, but like I don't like it either. Right? It's like it's not bad, but it's not good. If I had to describe it, I'd say mediocre and sometimes painfully mediocre, but we'll get into that. And like it's a weird thing to me because like it's more Dragon Ball, and I am always grateful to have more Dragon Ball in my life, and I certainly like I watched all the episodes, so it couldn't have been the worst thing. But it's like at the same time, it's like it was not my favorite experience, so I haven't been rushing to talk about that at length, and no one's making me. But I do feel like I have some things to say because like GT is Dragon Ball, right? Like it is part of the Dragon Ball family, and because of certain current events in the Dragon Ball community, it's more relevant than it has been before, and we'll get into that too. Okay, so assume that there will be spoilers ahead. Assume all those spoilers. Let's break this down. Then I'll give you another spoiler warning just to be sure. So I want to talk about how math is used throughout Dragon Ball GT, and it's like used a lot of the same ways that is used in Dragon Ball in general. But I want to talk about like in universe and outside universe, like math in that meta sense. Um, and I also want to talk about my experiences with GT and how I feel about it. Like, again, it's like it's not my favorite. I am not a fan, but I feel like I'm okay with talking about it though because like it won't. This won't be me bad mouthing it. I feel like if it was me bad mouthing it, like I don't think I would get anything out of that. That'd be useful to me, and I don't think it would really be useful for everyone else. Don't get me wrong. If I was gonna badmouth it, I would have fun with it, and I'd be funny about it. But I don't think that would be helpful. So I do want to talk about Dragon Ball GT and its place in Dragon Ball history. So again, assume spoilers ahead. Let's get into it. So when it comes to Dragon Ball GT, right? It came almost immediately after Dragon Ball Z ended in Japan. Like so when Dragon Ball Z like ended, GT started. It started in like 1996, running through the better portion of 1997 as well. So it had a good run. Depending on who you ask, I guess, but like 64 episodes, it could have been worse, right? Um, so yeah, 64 episodes, pretty standard anime length, and like about 20 or so minutes. And yeah, so that's how that. I'm sorry, it's also way late. But I was gonna say like to just start. Right, so we have the 64 episode anime, not based on manga material, and it's a continuation of the Dragon Ball Z anime, which was based on manga material, as was the Dragon Ball anime. And at the end of the day, right, like it's still gonna be based off of something Akira Toriyama did. And at the end of the day, even though people say, oh well, he had no involvement with it, it's like, well, not entirely true, right? Like he didn't have involvement with it at a certain point, but he definitely like okay some things or made it clear that okay, whatever, do your thing. And he also did like different character designs, so it's not like he had zero involvement in it. With that being said, um, yeah, so we have Dragon Ball GT, and right away it it hits you with some things, and I will try to save some of it for the end. But the idea is you have the Black Star Dragon Balls, and the idea is like, oh well, the nameless Namekian, like before he split into Kami and Piccolo, created like these special Dragon Balls, and it's like you get one wish and it could be pretty much anything. And then like if you don't collect those Dragon Balls within a year's time, the planet that you made the wish on, which is going to be Earth, right? It blows up. And it's like, okay, why? Just okay. I'm gonna save that to later. But that's the idea, right? And so like Dragon Balls have always been something that have been mathematical, right? Whether we're talking about the shape, their stars, the wishes, the restrictions on the wishes, or lack of restrictions in the case of the Black Star Dragon Balls, and like how long they're like stone and all that. And just like that whole quest for them, right? Like tracking down their locations and going on the adventures, fighting opponents as you get there. It's like it's math all along the way, and I think that's cool, right? Just in general. And so with the Black Star Dragon Balls, of course, because they are Dragon Balls, because you have your wishes and you have restrictions, or again like lack of restrictions of this part, and you have that time limit of getting them back to the planet that they started. So it's just like math off the board to start. And as far as the story is concerned, it picks up 5 years after the end of Dragon Ball Z. So it's just like 15 years after the Buu saga. If you're watching it in the English dub, they change it to 10 years, but that changes some things. It's just like that's a weird change. And I'm not like anti dub. Like I grew up on the Dragon Ball dub and just dubs in general. And I've also watched a lot of subs, but I don't like when things get changed like that, right? But anyway, so there's a wish that's made at the beginning accidentally by the peel off gang because reasons, which we'll get to. Um, and Goku gets turned back into a kid. Just to be clear, like his body gets turned back into the body of a kid. His mind is still the mind of Goku at that point in his life, so he's not really a kid, right? He's got a smaller body, and some things have been reversed, but he's still like an adult mentally. But part of the thing with the kid situation, which I think was dumb, but I get why they did it, and we'll get into that too. But the whole thing is, though, it does add an interesting dimension which they don't play around nearly enough. And it's like, okay, so he has a kid body that he has to adjust to now, right? And so, his attacks, his transformations, all of that are impacted. And we'll get to that too. And so with Dragon Ball, it's an anime and a manga about fighting. And there's math all up in that fighting, right? There's math and of course the choreography on like that meta level. But within universe, you have these characters and they're moving at these insane speeds, and they're using their key and they're keeping track of each other while trying to beat their opponents, right? And so there's a lot of math going on, right? There's math in the speed, math in the coordination of them, like registering where they are versus their opponent, and there's math in key and how you use it, that ability to charge it up and do damage, right? And there's math in the damage that they're doing in general, whether it be key or melee. And so it's like, yeah, you have these characters and they're squaring off and they're moving all around and just using math and speed, math and their attacks, math and covering this distance or that distance, or keeping track of their opponents and anticipating their actions and where they'll be at any given moment. That's all math. And I think that's cool. And then you have like I said, that idea of key. That is something that is mathematical too. Harnessing it, charging it, firing it off. Um, and that's cool, right? And then like you have the idea of like power level and power scalings, transformations and things like that. Those are all math. When it comes to power levels and power scaling, right? Like power levels were used in the Dragon Ball Z portion of the Dragon Ball story, right? And it's something that a lot of people latched onto because, right, you got this numerical value that indicated something about power, right? And it was subversive from the get go because it's like, well, you have a device that's indicating that there's a numerical value for someone's power, their battle capability. And so I say that it was subversive from like the jump because it's like, hey, the device is saying this, but it doesn't account for people who are hiding their power. It doesn't account for people's ability to raise their key, and so I think that's interesting. But like, power levels were such an interesting idea. So what happens when they're done? It's kind of like, well, we go back to basics in something that we like did but didn't really stop doing, right? The idea of power scaling. So if you don't have something like power levels to go off of, you go off of feats, you go off of what you see and what you know about the characters, and all of that is mathematical. Now, I would say that like power scaling is not always the easiest thing to do, and people, people complain about like Dragon Ball Super power scaling, but it's like, oh god, that was a problem a long time ago. And with GT in particular, it's like it's hard to scale like anyone, but trying to do it, I mean, in the act itself, it's math. And so I think that's cool. And then the idea of the transformations, because like if you take the Zaijinsu Seven, um, at its face value and like the established transformation multipliers, and you have Super Saiyan being like a 50 times multiplier, Super Saiyan 2 being, oh, and just to be clear, like a 50 times multiplier base. The Super Saiyan 2 is a 100 times multiplier of base, or 2 times Super Saiyan. Then Super Saiyan 4 is a 400 times multiplier of base, or 4 times strong is Super Saiyan 2. So we have these multipliers that we could go on to try to scale the powers. Like we don't know what the base power levels are, but like we can still kind of gauge how strong these characters are getting. And then for Super Saiyan 4, now that's a little interesting, because I think it might be tempting to say like, well, hey, isn't the Super Saiyan 4 as strong as like the Golden Zaru? Which if you take those multipliers, with Zaru being like a 10 times multiplier of the base, and Super Saiyan being a 50 times multiplier of the base, then the Golden Zaru has a 500 times multiplier of the base, like for that kind of power that you're getting from it. And so it could be tempting to say, well, hey, isn't Super Saiyan 4 like that, the same as that? But if you're like digging hard enough, or maybe even not that far, you'll start to see that it's like it's a little bit more ambiguous than that, right? It's like it draws out the user's like full potential, and there's like room to kind of grow, right? Kind of taking advantage of that whole Zen kind of thing that Saiyans do. So it's just like that's not like a very clear multiplier. But the idea is, power is just exploding. It is definitely some sort of multiplier without like um, a regular limit, right? It's like a variable multiplier. It's not fixed. And of course, we're dealing with the character's base, and how that grows over the course of the anime. But it's like so tricky with Goku though, because like Goku, as a kid, or is like in a kid's body, and then has the Super Saiyan 4 transformation. So it's like, how does that stack up in terms of like power versus like someone like Vegeta who's already an adult when that happens? It's like, or does it matter? Does like the Super Saiyan 4 transformation like just negate those like transformations? Because it seems like it does. Sorry, like negate the limitations of the Black Star Dragon Ball magic. There was a better way to say that. But my whole thing is like, whether we're talking about key, talking about transformations, or power scaling, and like all that good stuff, or the fights themselves, we're dealing with math across the board. Not to mention, we're dealing with the math in the animation and getting that idea of speed and strength across. And there's math in the animation, math in the lighting, math in the coloring, math in the sound and sound effects and the music. You name it, there's math across the board. Also, like Dragon Ball GT has like such a surreal feel to it, and I think like it feels like one a little shinier. Like, and that's something that had started to happen over the course of Dragon Ball Z anyway. So by the time you get to Dragon Ball GT, everything's shiny. Like it looks good. I will say that. But it's like it's interesting. So yeah, there's so many other things I could talk about in terms of how math is used throughout the series, but it's like the same as it's used in a lot of other ways in some of my math and Dragon Ball videos. But I wanted to talk about GT in particular because like it does all the same things. It's just like it doesn't hit the same, and so I want to talk about that. If you want to hear anything bad about Dragon Ball GT, it's okay. I get it. You can turn off. But I do want to talk about, like, I don't want to badmouth it forever, but I want to like get into my thoughts and why I said what I said at the beginning, like with it being mediocre. So if you're watching Dragon Ball Z, right, like it starts off crazy and it gets crazier. And I bring that up because like it was such a weird experience, like growing up with Dragon Ball Z, because like right, Dragon Ball came before that, but that's not what we were offered, or at least that's not what most people offered. And I'll get to that too. So we a lot of people, we started with Dragon Ball Z, right? Like over here in the States. And in the middle of Dragon Ball Z, when it eventually made it to Toonami and Cartoon Network, it we eventually got Dragon Ball running at the same time as Dragon Ball Z, and for quite a while too. And so Dragon Ball Z ends, Dragon Ball still going, and then bam, Dragon Ball GT. And so we had a lot of Dragon Ball at that time, not just with the anime, but like a lot of games coming out that time. I mean, there's a lot of Dragon Ball games out in like the 2000s. Like it was kind of wild, but so we had a lot of interesting things to compare G2 to, right? And I don't feel like it hits the same. For one, I don't think the fights are as interesting. Like they don't have the same like Toriyama fights and choreography to go off of. And while that is the case, it's not like people didn't study his work. It's not like they didn't have, a crap ton of the manga to go off of, 153 episodes of Dragon Ball and 291 episodes of Dragon Ball Z. I'm just saying they could have done better. So my thing is, right, like animation wise, the animation is actually good. But despite the animation being good, the fights are boring. So it's just like Dragon Ball GT, to its credit, it looks amazing, and again, it's animated well. But the fights are boring, the choreography is kind of crap, and there's way too many key blasts. And just to be clear, I like key blasts. They're cool. But it's just like it wasn't as inventive. And then like the whole Goku being a kid, that was dumb. I hated it. So did so many other people. Just to be clear, right? I get that the idea was to capture the magic of like the original Dragon Ball, turn Goku into a kid again, and have him go into this grand scale adventure. I get it. I get the logic. It doesn't mean I still can't think that it's dumb. Um, which I don't say lightly. I just hate the idea because it's like, well, I mean, Goku still was ultimately an adult, and you can make an argument that, well, Goku still has a lot of kid-like qualities, and it's like if you make that argument, then it's like, well, what's the point of making him an actual kid? And the idea is like, well, money and marketing and what people thought was good at the time. But yeah, I didn't like that. And to make it crazier, right? Like the first 16 episodes of Dragon Ball GT were something that if you were watching GT in the States back when it came out on Tsunami, you didn't see for a while because they skipped them. They skipped them and they combined like those first 16 episodes into a singular episode where they used clips of that episode to tell, what happened, right? So they had basically a summary episode. Um, and then eventually they came out with these so-called lost episodes that were not really lost, mind you. Um, and you know what? I haven't seen the so-called lost episodes. I mean, they're not great, and I can see the logic in skipping them, but it's still like, look, if you got the show and you're gonna bring the show, why skip it? And the crazy thing is, that's not the first time like things have been skipped when dealing with an English dub of Dragon Ball, because like with with Dragon Ball Z, um, back in the day when they had the Ocean dub, they spliced together episodes. So it's like I think it was like around the first 40, right? Like they spliced them together, so it was less episodes that you were seeing when it came to like the beginning of Dragon Ball Z and the whole Sand Saga, like from Raditz to like the end with Vegeta and all that. So it was more episodes than we saw back when it initially aired, which is a crazy thing to me. Like they combined some things like, so when a lot of people saw Dragon Ball Z, it's like we saw the first episode, but it was really like the first episode spliced together with the second episode in condensed with some parts taken out. And so it's like, okay, what? And then to make it crazier, like before Dragon Ball Z got popular here, they did try to like bring Dragon Ball here, but it was only in certain regions, like so, like in Hawaii and California, like with the Nippon network, and there was like the Harmony Gold version, which I think they did test it out in some cities too, and that didn't go well. But the whole thing is like they did try it, and they gave different characters. I mean, so they got the characters different names like Goku Zero and stuff like that. Um, and because it's like there's been a lot of Dragon Ball history, but I think the idea there too was like things were spliced. They like I think showed like the first few episodes of Dragon Ball, and then like spliced together parts of like one of the movies, and it's just like it's a mess. Um, but I bring all that up, which was a detour, to say that what they did with GT was not unprecedented with how Dragon Ball material has been handled over here in the West. Um, it's just like crazy to me. So like yeah, so they had a weird dub. They changed some details, some things up in a singular episode for a whole bunch of episodes. So it was off to a rocky start. And then like after that whole beginning arc, right? Like with the Black Star Dragon Balls, you get into the whole baby arc, and for some people, they really like that. I thought Baby was a lame villain actually. I like the idea of bringing back the Tuffles, but like Baby was lame. I stand by that. I thought like the Super 17 saga, that was interesting to a degree, but like they only had that be a few episodes. Um, and then with the Shadow Dragon arc, one of them was a fucking mole. It's like, no, no, you can't count that as a dragon. And honestly, there's a few others where it's like, no, come on, now. It's like, no, don't do that. I hated that. Although I thought Nova Shinron was pretty cool. But yeah, it was a whole weird thing. And then like at the end of Dragon Ball GT, they do a 100-year time skip, and that's like kind of wild because I feel like it's something that a lot of us probably did back in the day. When we were imagining like Dragon Ball like stories, and they went there, and then they had like Goku Jr. and Vegeta Jr., and that's the whole thing. But just to say that like I don't know, GT was a freaking weird ride. So you had the 64 episodes, and then you had like a Hero's Legacy, which is like honestly, it's not a bad movie. It's not great, but it's not bad. Um, but it was a journey. I don't regret watching GT. But I do think it was not the best. It was not my favorite. There's like times where the ideas I thought were dumb as hell. But then there was other times where the ideas weren't necessarily dumb. I just didn't think they were executed well. Like the Shadow Dragons, I don't think um, they were done poorly. Oh, sorry, blah. I don't. They were definitely done poorly, but like I don't think the idea was a bad idea. You know what I mean? Like especially when it's like, oh, well, you'll relied on the Dragon Balls too much. It's like, well, let's see what happens, right? But yeah, and again, like I don't want to like have this turn into me bad mouthing GT a bunch because I really do think it had good animation, despite the fights letting me down, and I do think it looked really good. Um, and if nothing else, it gave me more Dragon Ball, and also as much as I could say about GT, as much as anyone else could say about GT, we have a bunch of characters from GT that appear in video games, and I think that's cool, right? They make a regular appearance, right? Like seeing Super Saiyan 4 Goku or Super Saiyan 4 Vegeta is not uncommon. Let's not forget about Super Saiyan 4 Gogeta, and I'm thinking about like Budokai 3 with the white hair Gogeta. That was cool. And the whole 100x Big Bang Kamehameha, that looked cool as hell. Um, so it's like there were some good things that came out of GT, and I honestly do think that it had potential. But as is, there were ideas that I thought that were present that were dumb, and ones that I thought could have been executed better. And there were times where I was legitimately bored watching it. But again, it's like more Dragon Ball GT. Sorry, it's more Dragon Ball, and there were elements that I enjoyed. Like I enjoy like the Nova stuff, and there's elements of like Super 17 that I liked. And again, like I didn't like Baby as a villain, but I did think the idea of like something dealing with the Tuffles was a cool idea. Like having that come back on the Saiyans. I thought that was kind of cool. And again, like the Shadow Dragons, it's like the idea wasn't bad. The execution was piss poor, but I did like the idea. And, like there's a point, right, when I was younger, and it was like the internet was like it was the Wild West days. You can make an argument about that still going on, but like back then, like there weren't a lot of images for a lot of things. So you would just like read things about like different things that you cared about, and I happened to stumble across GT and just like hearing the Shadow Dragons and hearing their premise, that sounded cool as hell. So like seeing it was a different story. So it's just like it had a potential. Like on paper, it sounds like a good idea. But yeah, so I said a lot about GT. It's like it's not all bad. It's not my cup of tea, and there's a reason why. Like I didn't, rush to talk about it. It's just not my thing. But it is part of the Dragon Ball family. And to kind of close up, because I did say spoilers ahead for everything Dragon Ball at the beginning, so I don't feel bad about this. But like Dragon Ball Daima is pretty much Toriyama's take on GT. And so some of those ideas come back up, and some of them it's just like, hey, the idea about like Goku being a kid, that was dumb. And then it's like for Daima, it's everyone pretty much being a kid, and it's like Super Saiyan 4 does like make an appearance, and I don't know how I feel about that, but I do like that the hair and the fur match because like I don't know, it always looked like weird to me that like you go Super Saiyan 4, your hair stays black, but then you get like the red fur or Vegeta's like darker color fur. I think which is a different shade of red than Goku's. But I like that the hair and the fur match. But that's just a me thing. But yeah, so Daima, it was a lot of GT stuff in there mixed with a lot of Demon World stuff, and we'll talk more about that when I talk about Dragon Ball Daima because that's coming. So I guess my whole thing is like, how if you don't like GT, you probably didn't watch this video. And if you do like GT, you maybe did because you were curious to see what I had to say about it. But and if you did, like, don't let me sway you. You like what you like, and there's nothing wrong with that. You know, it's just like it didn't hit with me. So I mean, that's pretty much what I had to say. I'll see you in the next one.